Okay, so it's 5 past now. I think we're gonna start. So first of all, thank you everybody for joining. We're really happy to have you for this last lecture of this academic year. So this is the second year of our lecture series on advanced political economy, and building on our theoretical discussion last year. So this year we've run the lectures focusing a lot more on crises of capitalism, trying to bring bring the topics closer to our day-to-day life. So I hope you found the lecture so far useful. And today, so last week we discussed with Dr. Ying Chen the climate crisis, development, and capitalism. So this week with Dr. Yanis Dafermus, we're honing in a bit more on the macroeconomic side of the environmental crisis. So he's going to talk about the fiscal and monetary policies to deal with environmental crisis. As usual, the lecture will go on for about 40 minutes, and then our student discussant, Adam here, who's like sitting right next to me, he's gonna join as a discussant for 5-10 minutes, and then we'll open the floor for everybody to join in. And as usual, we will let you guys unmute and turn on your camera, and so that you can speak, ask question yourself. If you don't want that, you can simply just type it into the chat box, and then Adam here will read out the questions for you. Yeah, I think that's all for housekeeping. And let me quickly introduce our lecturer today, Dr. Yanis Dafermus, who generously agreed to speak for the last lecture of the series. Dr. Dafermus is a reader in economics at SOAS University of London here. So his research focus is on financial macroeconomics, climate finance, ecological macroeconomics, climate aligned development, inequality, and the political economy of the green transition. He had various roles as including a principal investigator and co-investigator in several projects about the role of macroeconomic and financial policies in the green transition. And he has also run capacity building programs on climate change for many central banks. So yeah, he has various roles here at SOAS and like various journals. He's a senior fellow at the SOAS Center for Sustainable Finance, as well as associate editor of various journals as well. So yeah, thanks for joining again, Yanis, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for having me. Thanks a lot for the introduction, and many thanks to all the organizers for inviting me to participate in this brilliant series. So what I'm going to do is, let me first share my slides. Hopefully you can see them now. So yeah, I'm going to follow up on some of the discussions that you had last time with Ying, but I will focus in particular on the role of fiscal and monetary policies. And what I'm going to do is to talk about what have been the discussions about the role of green fiscal and monetary policies, but I will focus quite a lot on what are the limitations of some of these policies, both from a political economy perspective, but also from an environmental justice perspective. So I will start by talking a little bit about the way that green fiscal and monetary policies have been analyzed, both from a mainstream perspective, but also from a heterodox perspective. And I will explain why we have very significant differences, of course, when we look at these types of policies from these different perspectives. Then I will move on to talk about the importance of environmental justice, given that this is something that is not always taken into account when people talk about fiscal and monetary policies. And then I will focus a little bit on specific types of fiscal policy tools that have been proposed or have been used. And I will also talk about the debate that we have seen in central banks about their role in terms of addressing the environmental crisis. And I will explain what is the current consensus and what have been some departures from this consensus. But at the end of my lecture, I would like to reflect on all this and explain, first of all, which types of policies perhaps might make more sense than others, but also what are the limitations of these policies and why sometimes these policies cannot be, I mean, in many cases, many of these policies cannot be considered politically feasible. And I will also reflect on whether these types of policies can provide a solution to the environmental crisis. So this is more or less what I will try to do in the next 40 minutes. And let me start with this table that I have prepared about the main differences between mainstream and heterodox approaches when it comes to the analysis specifically of fiscal and monetary policies. And let me highlight that in terms of heterodox approaches, I mean, I do not cover everything, all approaches. I have mostly focused on ecological economic approaches or post-Keynesian approaches, primarily because I would like to talk specifically about fiscal and monetary policies. There are, of course, other heterodox approaches that I will not cover, but I will be happy to discuss during the Q&A. So when it comes to policy proposals, I suppose all of you are very familiar with the mainstream idea that in order to address the environmental crisis, what we need to do is to put a price on nature. And this can refer specifically to carbon emissions when we are talking about the climate crisis, but it can also capture any aspect of nature. And very recently, we have seen a lot of excitement in the mainstream discussions about the potential of using pricing as a way of dealing with the crisis. So we have a lot of approaches that try to explain why it is a good idea to price, for instance, forests, and by doing that, we can incorporate them into the market system. So this is very much in line with the tradition of environmental economics, which is the mainstream approach to the environmental problems from an economic perspective. And then we have this discussion about what else can be done apart from pricing nature. And this is where we have seen a lot of interesting developments recently. And I would like to refer in particular to de-risking, because we have recently seen a lot of attention to what the state can do in order to facilitate the transition. And from a mainstream perspective, the role of state right now should be to de-risk private green investment. And this has been used primarily for the global south, but we have also seen recently initiatives in the global north that have this type of thinking about how we can use the state in order to achieve the transition. And basically what the state does is to support private capital and make private capital, make investment in green projects profitable for private capital. So from that perspective, the state has to basically allow markets to find a solution. And this is part of the broader market-based solutions that have been suggested. And this also includes the role of finance. I suppose you have you are very familiar with these recent discussions about biodiversity finance, about using credits, carbon credits in order to support the transition. So all this is in line with the mainstream thinking, either the traditional one, which requires to put a price on nature, or some recent versions of this mainstream thinking, which is about de-risking. Now, in contrast to what we see in the discussion about policies, and in particular macroeconomic policies in the context of heterodox approaches, is an emphasis on, first of all, the importance of having a big green state that does not just allow the private sector doesn't facilitate the investment from the private sector in green projects, but a state that regulates, has a very significant role in terms of public investment, perhaps nationalizes part of the energy system. And at the core of the analysis that we have seen in heterodox approaches is, of course, to have a kind of a policy mix where we combine fiscal tools with some monetary policy tools, and we have a kind of coordination. But when we also look at the literature about the growth, of course, we have this emphasis on the importance of reducing consumption, primarily in the global north, And there are many suggestions about how this can be done and how this can be combined with other policies like the reduction of working hours and so on. So the main difference is that we are looking at some more fundamental proposals about how to deal with the problem compared, of course, to the mainstream approaches which rely on markets. In terms of how the different approaches analyze policies, this is also important because what we see, according to the mainstream analysis, is this reliance on what is called cost-benefit analysis, where the idea is that putting a price on carbon, for instance, has a cost because people or firms have to pay for that, but it also has a benefit, and the benefit is that this can reduce climate damages in the future. And then you have this traditional analysis whereby there's a maximization of utility, there's a comparison of costs and benefits, and then you get the optimal outcome. Just to say that based on this analysis, William Milhouse, who got the Nobel Prize in economics about 6 years ago, argued that based on the data he used in 2018, that it would be optimal to get a temperature at the end of the century close to 3.5 degrees. So this analysis has been criticized quite a lot. And when we look at heterodox approaches, in terms of the analysis of policies, we see a very significant emphasis, first of all, on the distributional implications of these policies. So, for instance, when we are talking about carbon pricing, it's necessary to look at the distributional implications. We have an analysis of the role of power, who has the power to implement what, who benefits, who loses from specific policies. And we also have an emphasis on planetary boundaries. So if climate scientists say, for instance, that we need to do whatever it takes in order to avoid passing 1.5 or 2 degrees, we just need to find a way to do that. It's not about finding an optimal solution that crosses the planetary boundaries, as we often find in mainstream analysis. Now, I would like to say a couple of things about the role of finance, because when we are talking about monetary policies in particular, it's important to understand also what is the role of finance in these discussions. And I mean, again, when we look at the mainstream approaches, what we see is an emphasis on how finance and financial players in general can find ways to price environmental risks in order to incorporate them into their models. And this is about, again, market failures. So they recognize in many cases that there has been a market failure because the environmental risks have not been priced correctly. And then they have suggestions about how information about the environment can be taken into account in order to price these types of risks. And crucially, there is also a lot of attention from central banks with respect to the reduction of the exposure of the financial system to risk. So from this perspective, there are many financial institutions and central banks that care about climate change, not necessarily because they want to do something about the problem. It's mostly because they are afraid of the exposure of the financial system to climate or broader environmental risks. And as I will explain later, this is very problematic in the context of addressing the crisis. On the other hand, when we have heterodox analysis about the role of finance, it's mostly about emphasizing how finance has contributed to the problem, for instance, by providing loans to carbon-intensive companies, and how we can find ways to reduce the broader systemic risk that has been created by finance because it has been part of the problem. Finally, in terms of justice, I suppose you know that the term just transition is now used quite a lot in mainstream approaches. And what I would like to highlight is that in this approach, there's a very narrow way of defining what is a just transition. And we can discuss this later, but it is very clear that the just transition is a kind, even in the form that they define it, is just a kind of a secondary issue. First, there is an analysis about how emissions can be reduced, and then it comes as a kind of a second thought, how perhaps to reduce a little bit the distributional implications of that. On the contrary, in heterodox approaches, environmental justice has attracted much more attention. It's considered to be a fundamental problem, and you cannot design anything from the beginning if you don't take into account the role of environmental justice. So it's a much more fundamental issue, and I think it's good that recently heterodox approaches have started paying much more attention to that. So I would like to say a few things about environmental justice, primarily from a global justice perspective. This is important in terms of framing the discussion about the role of fiscal and monetary policies. So the first thing that I would like to point out is a fact that I'm sure everyone is very much aware of, which is that at the global level, the main contributors to the climate crisis are countries in the global north. And this is the case when we look at their cumulative greenhouse gas emissions. What matters for climate is the cumulative emissions or the stock of emissions, not the current flow of emissions. This is why we need to look at the historical emissions. And there are many empirical studies that show that most of these emissions have been generated by the global north. So we know that the problem has primarily come from these specific countries. However, when we look at vulnerability to climate change, it's also very clear that it's mostly the global south that is facing the problems from the change in atmospheric temperature. And I have here a map which illustrates that. I mean, there are a lot of different analyses that have shown what is exactly the problem. But for instance, here you can see the exposure to climate extreme events of people who were born in 2020. If we have a scenario whereby countries meet their commitments, the national determined contributions, but still we get an increase in atmospheric temperature close to 2.5, 2.6 degrees. And you can see with red the countries that are going to suffer more according to this scenario. You can see that many of them are in Southeast Asia, in Africa, some of them in Latin America. And you can see that in the global north, the countries that have high climate vulnerability are much less. So there's a climate justice problem, which is very clear because of this reality. Now, this problem has some other implications, and it is also associated with some broader issues that we are having with the global financial architecture at the same time. So first of all, if we recognize that the cumulative emissions have been mostly generated by countries in the global north, we need to accept that there is a climate debt, right? And a broader environmental debt if we take into account other environmental problems like plastic pollution that has been generated primarily by the global north as well. So we need to be very clear on the fact that there is a climate debt that the global north owes to the global south. I'm saying that because in many of the discussions that we have, for instance, as part of COP27 or COP28, many people talk about the fact that there's more climate vulnerability in the global south, but there's no explicit recognition of this climate debt. Now, when we combine this with the subordinate position of many countries in the global south in the global financial architecture, things become clearer in terms of the challenges that we are facing, because you might have that, for instance, the US can relatively easily use expansionary fiscal policy in order to support green investment, but many countries in the global south cannot do that in the same way. Because we have a currency hierarchy, because we have that whenever these countries try to use fiscal policy, they are the credit rating agencies that downgrade them. So the capacity to deal with the problem is lower. And this does not refer only to reducing emissions or even to climate adaptation. It also refers to the specific problem of addressing the losses and damages that come from climate-related events. So when we are talking about Barbados, for instance, it's very clear that there will be a very significant need in terms of spending money on dealing with losses, and there is no fiscal capacity in order to do so. So we need to take this into account as well in combination with climate debt. And we also have to consider that we have already seen a lot of climate losses and damages, but given that the atmospheric temperature is increasing every year, and it's not very likely that we're going to make the transition quickly, loss and damage are going to increase perhaps exponentially, which means that the amount of spending that will be required in many countries around the world will be very, very high. And of course, I have talked about global justice, but of course, within countries, we also have very significant inequalities that are created by the climate crisis. And we know that poor people have less capacity to deal with climate problems. For instance, if we have droughts and heat waves that affect agricultural productivity, many people who work in this sector can suffer. Those who are living in cities and they don't have enough money to protect themselves from floods are going to face very significant challenges. And we also know that, for instance, the climate crisis makes the life of women much more difficult compared to men, because in many countries in the global south, for instance, due to specific gender norms, women participate quite a lot in activities that are affected by climate quite significantly. And for instance, with the reduction in water supply, many women will have to spend more time to gather water. So overall, we have that both gender and racial inequalities will be affected quite a lot by the crisis. And this is something that also is not always part of the discussion about the policies. Now, the issue about global justice in the context of climate has been recognized in negotiations about climate. And this goes back to the early 1990s with the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And it has been recognized that the countries in the global south have to receive support, financial support from the global north in order to be able to invest in climate. And I have here some figures that show how this support has evolved over the last years. And there are three specific problems with what we have seen so far. The first problem is that if you look at the amount of finance that has been provided to the global south, this is extremely small compared to the needs. And I mean, even the targets that had been set a few years ago or a few decades ago about this climate finance have not been met. So very small amount. Second, if you look at the decomposition that I have on the left-hand side graph, you can see that adaptation is a small part and mitigation is a much more important part of this finance. Why is that a problem? Because most of these countries have very significant needs in terms of investing in climate adaptation. And mitigation, of course, is part of their strategy. I mean, many of these countries are going to invest in mitigation, but mitigation is mostly the responsibility of the global north. And the fact that adaptation finance has not been at the core of this climate finance, so in general, is a big problem. And finally, perhaps another very significant, perhaps the biggest problem is that all this finance is provided in the form of, most of this finance, is provided in the form of loans. If you look at the decomposition of these, grants constitute a relatively small part. What does it mean? It means that countries that don't have the responsibility about the climate crisis get some finance to invest in mitigation to reduce their emissions, but then debt increases and then they face debt crisis. And in many cases, as you know, these countries are asked to implement austerity policies in order to address the debt problem. So this is not solving the issue. And this has also been criticized quite a lot, but we haven't seen any significant changes in terms of the broader approach to the provision of climate finance to the global south. Now, having said all this, I would like to focus on some specific fiscal policy tools and say a few things about what is the idea behind these tools and what are their limitations. So carbon pricing, as I said at the beginning, is the main policy that has been suggested, is very much in line with the mainstream environmental analysis. about how to deal with the climate problem. And recently, we have seen a lot of initiatives about introducing carbon prices in many countries around the world. I have here a map from World Bank that illustrates which countries have recently introduced a form of carbon pricing or are in the process of introducing a carbon pricing scheme. Let me say that there are two ways to introduce a carbon price. You can either have a carbon tax or you have a kind of a market system whereby carbon permits are exchanged. So in that case, you have a market that determines the price of carbon. And I don't want to go into the details about these two different approaches, but what is important to highlight is that carbon pricing can have very significant distributional effects. Why? Because if carbon prices go up, in most cases, you have companies, energy companies that pass this higher carbon price on to energy prices. And then we have poor people that need to spend a significant proportion of their income facing higher proportion of their income in the form of energy bills. So they need to pay higher energy bills and they suffer more compared to richer people. So there is a distributional impact, and it's very unlikely that carbon pricing in any case is going to lead to a significant reduction in emissions. And I think it's interesting to see that sometimes World Bank or IMF suggest carbon pricing as a solution to everything when they make suggestions to countries in the global south. And of course, it's very clear that this cannot work in many countries. You cannot have a very high increase in carbon prices and assume that it's going to solve the problem. Now, recently, with the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, a lot of attention has been paid to green subsidies as another fiscal policy tool that can be used to address the problem. And I mean, you can find a lot of green tax credits, which is a kind of a subsidy in the Inflation Reduction Act. The idea is that instead of creating a kind of a contractionary effect in the economy through having higher taxes, carbon taxes, the idea of green subsidies is to stimulate the economy and at the same time to achieve environmental problems. Now, 2 or 3 things about that. First, at the end of the day, what green subsidies do is that they improve the profitability of companies. And by improving the profitability of companies, the idea is that companies will be incentivized to make more green investment. But if we are talking about companies that have already very high profits, perhaps this is not enough to make them change their business model. Second, the idea that there is a support of private companies and in terms of increasing their financial returns is very much in line with the idea of de-risking. So by promising high subsidies to companies that are going to invest more in green projects, at the end of the day, what we get is that these companies have lower risks if they invest in the green economy, and therefore they might be more willing to do this type of investment. So at the end of the day, what you have is that the state tries to provide support to the private sector, and then it's up to the private sector to decide what is best to do. Now, another issue is what we call macroeconomic rebound effects. If you have that there is green subsidy, at the end of the day, you have an expansionary policy. You might have that profits go up. As a result of this, there might be more investment, more incomes, but this will lead to new emissions because as the economy grows, as it has been highlighted very clearly from the growth literature, as the economy grows and you don't have that the economy relies 100% on renewables or doesn't produce any pollution, you are going to still have that. So you generate more pollution. And therefore, you cannot just have a policy that simulates the economy. This is not going to work for the environment. And finally, a very significant issue related to what I said before about environmental justice. If you look at the decomposition of these investments, you can see a lot of investments in electric vehicles, in batteries, in solar panels, but all these require specific materials, right? They require lithium, copper, and this, in most cases, comes from countries in the global south. In most cases, there is exploitation of people or ecosystems in the global south. because the extraction of some of these minerals is not very good for the environment. And of course, big companies that have a benefit from extracting these materials, in most cases, do whatever it takes to make sure that the labor cost will be lower and they will not have to pay a lot of money for these very significant materials in the context of the green transition. So now with IRA, this green extractivism problem is perhaps going to be exaggerated and become more important. So green public investment has been considered perhaps as a different, a better way of thinking about the use of fiscal policies to achieve the transition. And it's also part of various Green New Deal proposals. Now, when we are talking about green public investment, I just wanted to highlight that in the context of climate, it's important to make a distinction between spending on mitigation, which is about doing stuff that is going to reduce emissions, spending on adaptation, which is about changing the way sometimes that we produce or consume, given that we have climate change. And this can include systems where we manage water differently, can include different ways of producing in the agricultural sector. All this type of spending is becoming more important because we are in the climate crisis and things are getting worse every year. But on top of that, we have spending that is related to the fact that at the end of the day, even if you do adaptation, it's very difficult to avoid some significant losses because you have hurricanes that destroy properties, you have crop failures in agriculture, and therefore there should be a mechanism through which the government perhaps covers some losses related to climate. So these are different types of spending in terms of their connection with the climate problem. And I mean, in principle, green public spending can play a more strategic role, and it can also change, in principle, the role of the private sector. Why? Because if you develop, for instance, a plan whereby you nationalize the energy system of a country, and then you use public investment in order to make it green, this can reduce the power of private capital. But the question is how exactly this green public investment approach will be used. And of course, the governments might decide to use a very light approach to public investment, in which case we don't have any change in the distribution of power. And what is also interesting is that there are some potential interactions between public investment and consumption, because in many cases we are talking in the context of the growth about how we can reduce consumption. And of course, sometimes the argument is that people need to change the way that they think about their well-being. But there's also an argument that with more public investment, let's say in public transport, you give the capacity to people to stop using so much their cars. Just an example, in which case you have that there is a decarbonization of public transport if you have that the government makes investment in zero or low carbon transport, and at the same time, through this investment, it makes it easier for people not to use cars. So we can have some interesting interactions there. But broadly speaking, green public investment can be used in different ways. It can be used in a way that at the end of the day serves the interest of private capital. It can be used in ways that perhaps can achieve some change in the distribution of power. But the other very significant issue is that when we are talking about public investment, there are some countries that can perhaps relatively easily use their powerful position in the global financial architecture and conduct expansionary fiscal policy, but there are other countries that really struggle with that. And when we look at the global south, what we see is this vicious cycle about the interaction between climate change and public debt, whereby you have a country that is very much exposed to climate change. Because of that, it's difficult to have a low cost of borrowing. Why? Because the problem is that now many financial investors are basically looking at climate, and they don't want to invest in countries that look very risky. So this increases the cost of borrowing. The high climate vulnerability means that there is a lot of spending on loss and damage. because of high public debt that is created as a result of this spending and the high cost of borrowing, it's more difficult to invest in adaptation. And the less you invest in adaptation, the higher is the climate vulnerability. So this is a vicious cycle that is very burdensome for many countries in the global south. And just to illustrate why this might become worse, if you look at what credit rating agencies are doing right now, they are trying to understand what are the financial implications of climate change. And they're going to take into account that, for instance, you might have India or Bangladesh that are more exposed to climate change. They will need to spend more money on that. And therefore, their expectation is that these countries will have higher risks, and therefore they might downgrade them. And you can see that the countries that are considered, according to their analysis, to be more vulnerable to changes in their ratings are, again, many countries in Africa or Southeast Asia. So this is going to exacerbate the problem that I mentioned before. Now, when it comes to central banking, I just wanted to talk a little bit about that because I think it's interesting. And we are having, initially, a few years ago, central banks really didn't want to talk about climate. They didn't consider this as part of their job. But very recently, this has changed. And there's a kind of consensus in central banking that, yes, climate is a problem. The broader environmental crisis is a problem. But they don't want to be part of the solution of the problem. They just want to find ways to react to that problem. And one way through which they have reacted to the problem is by analyzing the risks that climate poses to the financial system. And this is why many central banks have conducted this climate stress test, where they try to analyze how the financial system is exposed to specific types of climate risks. So it's mostly about protecting the financial system from climate change. More recently, there has been a lot of discussion about how climate change can perhaps increase inflation or make inflation more volatile. And central banks now are trying to understand how they have to change the way that they make projections about inflation in order to take into account the effects of climate change. And we also have that there's this argument that at the end of the day, they want to understand the effects of inflation, they want to understand the effects on the financial system, but they don't want to do anything more than that because it's mostly the governments that have the responsibility for addressing the environmental crisis. And many central bankers also insist on the fact that they want to be independent, they don't want to interact with the government, and they want to focus primarily on inflation. So this is the kind of the main approach that you can see among central bankers. Now, interestingly, we have seen some departures from this kind of consensus. And this has also come from central banks in the global north. So the Bank of England, for instance, decided a few years ago, 3 years ago, to decarbonize its corporate bond purchase program. They did so because the UK government changed the mandate, and they included explicitly climate into the secondary mandate of the Bank of England. And then the bank reacted to that, saying that they will take into account some climate criteria in order to change the way that they buy corporate bonds. So, I mean, the program was not very large in the UK, but they did something like that. Interestingly, they didn't want to depart from market neutrality. So they're going to keep the representation of specific sectors in the bond market the same as in their program. They didn't want to distort the market, if I use the terminology that they use for that. So they found a way to do this by sticking to market neutrality. I mean, to be honest, the way that they did that didn't have any significant impact because they really didn't want to do more fundamental changes. They're just going to adjust a little bit their portfolio. The ECB did something similar last year, but they decided to depart a little bit from market neutrality. And then I can explain the details if you are interested in how exactly they did that. But compared to the Bank of England, they were more or less fine to not to follow exactly market neutrality in order to take into account some climate criteria. So we have analyzed these programs in these reports that I have on the slide. And I think I have shared one of these as part of the readings. Now, if you look at the global south, we see something in many cases very different. I mean, the Reserve Bank of India, or the Bangladesh Bank, they have a tradition in terms of using credit guidance. And they have used credit guidance in order to support specific green sectors. Now, from the perspective of a central bank in the global north, this is considered to be problematic because you have that central banks do not respect market neutrality, they intervene and they allocate credit. But because of the climate crisis, now in the global south, we see much more initiatives that are in the context of having a financial policy that is in line with the green transition. And we can also see that People's Bank of China has taken a lot of initiatives in this direction. For instance, they have included green bonds in their collateral framework. So there's more intervention in the global south compared to the global north. And this illustrates differences in terms of the history of central banks in these countries. So I'll try to finish within the next 5 minutes or so. So I think I have used all of my time right now, but I would like to highlight a few things before I finish. So let me say what I think is important to take into account when we are talking about climate finance, and in particular when we want to take into account global justice issues. And this is related to some of the points that I have just that I made before. So now that we are having that climate finance is becoming more important in the way that the financial system works, and climate finance is becoming more mainstream, we have that a lot of financial institutions, including credit rating agencies, as I said before, try to analyze what is their exposure to the climate risks that countries are facing. And a problem with that is that now we are seeing that many of these financial institutions are understanding that they are exposed, especially to physical risks. And in the coming years, I think it's very likely that we'll try to reduce their exposure to these risks. Now, when this happens, for instance, in government bond markets, it means that interest rates for countries in the global south go up. And therefore, by trying to protect themselves from climate change, they are creating more problems in terms of the access to finance for the global south. So this is a first problem. Another one is related to what I said before in terms of green extractivism. We have that with green finance, any company that shows that they engage with green investment or reduce their emissions need to get more support from the financial system. But what is not taken into account is that first, many of these companies use the extraction of transition minerals in order to exploit ecosystems and people in the global south. Second, many of these companies engage in very big renewable energy projects that use land, a lot of land in the global south, and create other types of problems in the ecosystems in the global south. No, I mean, nobody is looking seriously into that. And another big problem is that now that we are talking about net emissions, so net emissions are the gross emissions minus the emissions that can be avoided because companies pay for carbon offsets. Now that we are having that net emissions are used in many metrics about climate finance, there is a higher incentive for companies to use carbon offsets. And carbon offsets can be very problematic because in most cases we are talking about offsets that are related with, let's say, forests in Indonesia or in Brazil, whereby the idea is that companies pay people not to use the forest or not to engage specific agricultural activities because this is supposed to be good for the environment. But at the end of the day, this changes completely the life of people in these countries. And now carbon offsets are expanding, and this problem, I think, will become worse. And finally, we have what I said before about de-risking, but in the context of the global south, it's very important to highlight that when the discussion about green investment is taking place among those who work in IMF, World Bank, or these institutions, The starting point is that these countries don't have fiscal space. This is a term that is used in order to be able to undertake green investment. And therefore, what we can have, according to this approach, is that private financial institutions go to these countries, invest their money, but the problem is that they are not going to do that if you don't have a reduction in the risks that they face. And this is where governments try to find ways to provide subsidies, to have a regulation that is good for the private investors, to promise that if there is any problem, they are going to step in and cover financial losses. And by doing so, they make the investment attractive for these institutions, these investors. But of course, the local implications can be very severe. And in the long run, they can be even more significant because sometimes public debt increases as a result of that. So de-risking is another problem that we are facing now with climate finance. Now, I would like to say a few things about what, in theory, could be a kind of a policy mix, macroeconomic and fiscal policy mix, that could be more promising from the perspective of the environment and from the perspective of environmental justice. So let me explain what could be more promising, but then I will very briefly explain also what are the limitations of what I'm going to describe. So if we're going to have, if we're going to use monetary and fiscal policy tools in a way that is consistent with the crisis that we are facing, I think that we need to have that public investment should be at the core. Public investment should be accompanied by nationalizations whenever this is considered to be necessary in order to make the transition quickly. We need to have environmental regulation as part of the whole package because environmental regulation is necessary in order to make clear to the private sector that it's necessary to take action for climate, and if not, they will be basically illegal. And we need to have a combination of sticks and carrots. So you need to have penalties for the private sector when they don't comply. In some cases, especially for smaller companies, you also need to have some carrots in order to support the transition process. Then, of course, in terms of how to finance public spending, we need to have much more progressive taxation. We can also have taxes on big carbon-intensive companies. And central banks need to be part of this process because they can reduce the cost of borrowing, they can support the financing of government spending, either through asset purchases, collateral frameworks. I mean, there are different ways for central banks to do that, but it's important to support this process. And they also need to play a significant role in decarbonizing private finance. So if you look at financial flows, you will see that the big banks around the world have provided a lot of fossil finance. And this cannot change if there is no financial regulation that is trying to address that. Now, one big problem is that in many cases, governments or central banks implement some green policies, but there are no conditionalities in terms of environmental justice. And for instance, you can introduce a lot of specific conditionalities related to how specific companies engage with the global south. And you can have specific criteria about carbon offsets, not to accept carbon offsets. You can have criteria about related to green extractivism, and there should be no support. Actually, there should be penalties for companies that engage with green extractivism. There are ways to do that. From a technical point of view, it requires some work, but it's possible to do this. And then, of course, the big problem is that the global south cannot use fiscal policy in the same way as the global north, and they have to concentrate primarily on adaptation losses and damages, but these are becoming now, I mean, the spending on that is becoming even more important as the climate crisis is becoming deeper. And what I would like to say is that in many cases, we are talking about green fiscal monetary policy coordination within the context of a country, but because of the environmental debt problem and the climate justice problem, we really need to think beyond national borders, and we need some very radical changes in the way that financial support is given to countries in the global south. I have made some suggestions about having a climate just facility. I can talk about that in the Q&A. But the main point is that we cannot just talk about fiscal and monetary policies in the global north. The global south has a very different capacity, and this needs to be addressed, and it should be at the starting point of any type of fiscal monetary policy coordination in the context of the green transition. Now, these are some general elements, let's say, of kind of a more promising macro policy mix. But is it feasible to implement all these policies? And the short answer is no. I mean, we have private companies that wouldn't like to have any penalties. They would oppose any conditionalities that have to do with environmental justice simply because it's not profitable for them not to exploit workers in the global south. And what they try to do is to argue that they are willing to participate in the green transition and they want the state to de-risk their investment. Then we have central banks that primarily in the global north that are not willing to be part of a climate policy mix. They want to remain market neutral based on how they think about market neutrality. And they would oppose any coordination with the government because they would consider this as a problem for their independence. And we have governments in the global north that, although in some cases they accept that they have a responsibility for the cumulative greenhouse gas emissions, but they are not willing to accept the implications of this responsibility. So if you look at the discussions about the loss and damage fund in COP28, you cannot find anything about climate justice. And crucially, even if there was a way to implement these types of policies, still, this would not be enough to save the planet, of course. And this is also where the arguments from the degrowth literature are very important because we also need to look at how we consume, and we cannot just continue consuming in the same way in the global north primarily, because it generates not only a lot of emissions, but many other types of pollution, like plastic pollution. It causes deforestation. It reduces the supply, the availability of water. So we also need to look at consumption and find other ways to find ways to stop increasing consumption indefinitely in the coming years. So this is just to highlight that all these policies have a lot of constraints when it comes to how they can be implemented. And we, of course, need to be very much aware of all these constraints because we are very, very, very far from having a kind of way to deal with the environmental crisis. But I would like to leave it as an open question of what can be done in practice, given that we have all these political economic constraints. So I can get back to this issue in the Q&A. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Yanis. That was a great lecture as expected. I think it was really thorough and it went like in depth into, the link between like the finance and monetary fiscal policy and the climate crisis. I'm sure I can already see that like quite a few questions are coming in. Before we open the floor to like everybody, let's have our student discussant Adam to come in and ask you a few questions or either comment a little bit. And then we will have you guys, speak, answer questions for yourself. So, yeah, Adam, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Juani. I can see there are a lot of questions, so I'll keep this reasonably brief. And thank you, Yanis, a lot for what was a really interesting lecture. I think I wanted to pick up, I suppose, towards the end around feasibility, because I think listening to the lecture really highlights the scale of the challenge globally to dealing with the environmental crisis. I mean, even in terms of domestic fiscal and monetary policy, we're still very far away from where we need to be. We have the majority of green fiscal policy tools being limited to the focus on carbon pricing, and then things like the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, is kind of seen as this more radical green policy. But as you point out, Yanis, it's very much a pro. It supports private enterprise and causes a lot of other issues. It's quite far away from the green public investment that we might need. And then in terms of monetary policy, again, there's this movement, and central banks are taking maybe a very small step in the right direction, but this is limited and not necessarily joined up with the fiscal approaches. And that's before you talk about climate justice, which I think makes that gap seem very, very wide, right? Where it's clear that there's nowhere near enough finance, and as you point out, primarily in terms of loans, and therefore entrenching that subordinate financial position of global South countries. So I think to kind of make some initial points on feasibility of how we go from that situation to maybe where we want to be, and there's that. You describe quite well, I think, how private companies are going to naturally resist particularly the scale of the changes required. Like even if they support green policy, it's going to be either a very minor form of ecological or green policies, and they're going to be much more supportive, of course, of the carrot based policies, right? Subsidies and potentially carbon credits, where there are plenty of free credits provided to them. Likewise, central banks in the global north, by not departing from market neutrality, kind of significantly limits their ability to implement the monetary policy changes required. And then global north governments clearly are not in a place of talking about taking responsibility, this level of climate responsibility. So I guess, yeah, taken together, serious challenge. And I think one of the first things that occurs to me is whether, maybe a more minor point, but does there need to be a fundamental change to central banking, particularly in the global north? So do we need more democratized central banking? Is that a prerequisite to any of this? I mean, can you have central bank independence and do what we're talking about here? But even with that, then you've still got this very significant kind of political challenge and hurdle where governments have to regulate considerably more, expand green public investment, and take on that climate responsibility. And I know it's probably the very general question that how can we overcome this political challenge? And is that the case of allowing these small movements to happen as they have with central banks taking on more responsibility, or does that need to move considerably quicker than it is at the moment? So that was the more kind of general point that I took away from the lecture. But some of the other things I wanted to bring up, particularly relating to climate justice, I guess I just thought that you speak a lot about kind of transfers and finance, and I guess we're talking debt relief, grants, limiting the amount of loans to global South countries. Is there even broader scope for what climate justice should capture, in the sense of you mentioned kind of resettlement for disasters as a fiscal policy applied at a country level, but then is there going to need to be a broader provision for climate refugees, for example, and is that also kind of a key point and a part of what's required from a justice standpoint? And then another thing linked to this was, is there a way that global South countries can protect themselves? I mean, is this something that, if it's not joined up and if it's not facilitated by the global North, the global South countries, because of their subordinate position and financial architecture, aren't able to do anything, or are they able to protect themselves in some ways from green extractivism and this increased financial vulnerability because of their greater exposure to climate vulnerability? And then finally, very, very last point was around consumerism, and you touched on it quite a lot, so I wanted to kind of ask the question explicitly. But yeah, around consumerism, and I guess the kind of degrowth argument of, if we've got, even if you bridge the gap, even if you manage to have this fiscal monetary policy that incorporates climate justice, if there continues to be an increase in consumption over time, that still might not be enough. Even if we manage to solve the carbon issue, there's many material problems and different planetary boundaries that might be pushed up against in this case. So I suppose with that in mind, should policies should lower consumption and that, well, should a target of lower consumption be a part of the policy package? And should that be something? I mean, you talk about green public policy such as transport, but is there a broader way of integrating that? And if so, should that be a top-down approach? And I guess linking decrease in consumption kind of throws a further issue in terms of feasibility, because the political will for like degrowth approaches is obviously very limited. So I think that's probably enough points. So I'll throw it back, and thank you again, Yanis, for a great lecture.
Thank you, Adam. I mean, I'll try to respond to some of these broader questions or issues that you raised. I mean, great points, and yeah, there's no easy answer to most of these broad questions, to be honest. But perhaps let me comment on some of those. Now, let me start with what you said about what countries in the Global South can do if, at the end of the day, they cannot get a lot of financial support from the Global North. I think it's very important for them to find a way to deal with the crisis. And this is why when we are talking about justice, we also highlight that for many countries in the Global South, the priority should be climate adaptation and how to deal with losses and damages. So from that perspective, it makes sense to give a priority on that. Of course, at the same time, they need to take into account that if the Global North makes the transition, this can create problems to them as well, in the sense that, for instance, in the European Union right now, we are having this introduction of the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is going to make the carbon-intensive exports of the Global South more expensive. So as long as the Global South doesn't decarbonize the economy, they will facing also new shocks that are coming from the Global North, which perhaps exacerbate the problem with climate justice. So they have to take this into account, but the more fundamental problem is related with climate damages. And there are ways to, for instance, central banks in the Global South are trying to find ways to use some national policies to support decarbonization. I mentioned what the Bangladesh Bank has done, and the Bank of India with their credit guidance, they are trying to support the green sectors, because this is a way to achieve decarbonization. I mean, it might not be sufficient, but it's a tool that can be used. And then in terms of fiscal policies, there is always some space to implement some green fiscal policies without necessarily requiring the issuance of additional public debt, given that this is a kind of a constraint according to their position in the current hierarchy. So I think it makes sense for them to try to identify priorities and do whatever is possible. But we know that this will not be enough, and this is a problem, which doesn't mean that countries should not try to take action. Now, what you said about central banking and how to democratize central banking, I mean, it's a very important point, because nowadays we are central banks use the term independence, but of course, we know that they are not independent of what financial markets want and what they do. And I think a case can be made that we need a very different central banking that will have very different mandates. The question is whether we have the political economy about that. And I mean, it's very difficult to see this happening. I mean, central banks at some point became willing to engage with climate, but the way they are doing that is very much in line with the traditional way of thinking about central banking. I don't think that it's very likely to see changes in the mandates of central banks unless you have a government that is willing to do that. And for instance, when we were having the discussions with the Labour Party before 2019 about how it would be possible to decarbonize finance in the UK, there was a question of whether it's feasible or not to change the mandate of the central bank. And I think at the end of the day, it really depends on how each government is going to address this, because governments can decide to change the mandates of central banks. I don't think that this is going to come from central banks. It's more likely to come from governments that have a very different way of thinking about the role of central banks. And I mean, when you look at the Global South, you see a lot of heterogeneity in terms of the mandates of central banks, which shows that There are a lot of different options, but yeah, the question is what governments are willing to do. Now, in terms of consumerism, I mean, totally agree. If you look at projections about temperature, it's very likely to avoid 2 degrees if you don't find a way to reduce the growth that comes from consumption. And it's easy to say that. It's perhaps more difficult to do this. I think it's very important. I mean, if you ask someone who works on the growth, they might say that people have to change the way that they think about their well-being and they need to consume less. I think, yes, this is important, but I don't think this will be enough. We need at the same time as a society to for instance, highlight that there are very rich people that consume a lot. And by using, for instance, more progressive taxation, we can reduce their consumption. I mean, you could in principle use carbon footprints associated with specific products. It might be more complicated in practice, and there might be some side effects also for the poor. So this requires a little bit more thought. But using progressive taxation, having restrictions in terms of flights, for instance, I mean, there are ways to restrict consumption, but I think it's also important to facilitate that. And this is why I refer to public investment, because you might ask people not to consume a lot, but if, for instance, they cannot go to their work if they don't have a car, I mean, what are they going to do? So it's necessary at the same time to make it possible for people to make some changes in the way that they consume. And this also refers to food, because, for instance, when we are talking about land use change, it's very difficult to avoid deforestation if we continue having meat-based consumption in the same way that we have nowadays. So we need to make changes related to all these issues. And to be honest, at the end of the day, you need to have some regulation. And without regulation, you cannot have very significant changes, because so far we have seen approaches that have focused primarily on incentives, but I think regulation can be much more fundamental. Maybe, I mean, yeah, you made a lot of great points. Perhaps one more, what you said about refugees and how to deal fiscal policies in the global south. I mean, sometimes there is this discussion about the fact that, of course, climate change is creating many climate refugees. And I mean, to be honest, I don't like this global north perspective that because there will be climate refugees, this is becoming a problem also for the global north. I mean, the problem of climate justice is there, but sometimes people refer to this in order to say that it's also in the interest of the global north to support financially the global south. Because at the end of the day, there will be much more, we are going to have a much more unstable world if we don't address climate damages in the global south. But to be honest, I don't like this argument, but it's part of the reality. And when it comes to what countries in the global south can do when they are facing these problems, I mean, sometimes the problems are so fundamental. For instance, if you think about small island developing states, I mean, if the sea level increases, of course, there are ways to deal with that. Perhaps people need to go to another line. I mean, it's not an easy way. If this continues in the coming decades, we just need to find ways to support these people who might need to go and live somewhere else, unfortunately. And these are big problems that also illustrate why climate scientists highlight that we don't have to pass some thresholds. And after that, the situation becomes extremely difficult to deal with. So I think it's important to have priorities in terms of what is coming. And this is why I think it makes sense for many of these countries, given that they have contributed very, very little to the cumulative emissions, to focus quite a lot on adaptation and losses and damages. Yeah, but yeah, it's not easy to find the right balance. Maybe I'll stop there because I can also see that there are a lot of questions in the chat box as well, and I would like to try to address as many as possible. But I don't know how you would like to do that. Would you like to read the questions, or?
So ideally, we would like to invite them to like unmute themselves and then ask. And I think I'll take the questions as first come, first serve. And I see that YT, I'm sorry, I don't know what your name is, but you have a lot of questions. But for the sake of, to even out the opportunity to ask questions, I'll ask you to pick just one out of the many questions that you had. Yanis, do you prefer to take questions one by one, or like take a few and then do you have a preference?
I'm very open to whatever works best. So maybe I can take, because I can see a lot of questions, maybe 2 questions and then I respond to those.
Yeah, okay, sounds good. So yeah, and can I ask everyone to be try to be concise when asking questions? Can I invite YT first if you have chosen the question to ask? Do you want to unmute yourself and ask a question?
Yes. Thank you, Yanni, for this very broad and thoughtful presentation. I have, of course, a bunch of questions. Feel free to answer by email. I mean, I can put it in the chat, but the one I would like to pose is the one of how the penalties will be distributed and to whom. My prima facie approach to this would be that everybody on the planet will get a dividend, because the assumption is that each of us is a victim of the ramifications of the climate change. So can you make a comment on how we would distribute? Would it be a distributed or centralized go to government? Thank you.
Thank you. And for the second question, I'll invite Abhishek to unmute yourself. Let me see where you are, and I can ask you to unmute. Oh, yeah. Hi, Abhishek. Can you unmute yourself now?
Yeah. Hello.
Yeah, hello.
Hello, that was very nice lecture. So basically, I'm figuring out how far the the climate policy and all. So it will impact the whole wage labor nexus basically. Like if you see the rise of managerial capital and financialization since 70s and 80s, so it has like consequence on wage labor as well. So how we will go through this heterodox lens to sort it out. That's my concern.
So what you're asking is related to financialization primarily or labor as well? So I don't know if you can hear me, but yeah, that's fine. I can comment on that. That's fine. So maybe let me start with the question about penalties. And yeah, thank you, Yanni, for this question. It's a very important one. I think what I mean when I refer to penalties, and in particular when I use this combination of sticks and carrots, is that you cannot just have some subsidies, some incentives for companies in particular to make a change. Because when you do that, you don't take into account that there are some very big corporations that even if there are some green incentives, they don't have actually a benefit, financial benefit to make a change in their business model. So I was referring in particular to these big private companies, whereby it's very important to tell them that, you are not going to reduce your emissions in the next 2 or 3 years, then you lose access to loans, you lose access to public financing, and there are also regulations that don't allow you to operate. So these are penalties that you can have, which will, in principle, make it more likely that these companies are going to make a change. Now, if you have these penalties, of course, there will be a kind of a cost that can be distributed to the society. For instance, if we're talking about a company that employs many people, and for some reason they don't make the transition, and then they have financial problems, this will have implications for people. And this is where it's very important to also think carefully about how you use your fiscal policies and financial policies to support those that might suffer from the transition. And it's not easy, but in principle, you can have different approaches to smaller companies. You can have that people receive social transfers if they are affected by the transition. You also have these carrots that in principle can also incentivize other parts of the economy to reduce emissions. And you also need to have a state that is willing, as I said before, to increase its size if necessary to make the transition happen. And if you combine these initiatives with some penalties, it's more likely to have a quicker transition. But it's very important to make sure that the distribution of the financial implications of penalties will be as equal as possible. So it's not enough to have penalties. You also need to think about the distributional issues. Now, let me say a couple of things about the waste labor nexus and financialization. I think there is a kind of an interaction. I mean, I'm not going to talk about all the debates about financialization in the global south and so on. But what I would like to highlight is that climate is introducing now some new realities in the way that we think about financialization and exploitation of labor in the global south. Because I'm talking about cases in which we have companies that, in the name of the green transition, can exploit workers. We are talking about financial institutions that, in the name of transition, they support specific green projects in the global south. And this might not change the fundamental process that we have seen in the past, but it can, from a political point of view, legitimize what we have seen so far in terms of the exploitation of labor. And it creates a kind of new opportunities for financialization. This is why people use the term green financialization in order to capture some of these processes, which I think requires some specific attention. I mean, they might not change fundamentally what we know about these processes in the past, but we are talking about a new scale, and there might be some legitimization of these policies because of the green transition. And for instance, when we are talking about green extraction, it's a specific form of, green extractivism. It's a specific form of extractivism, but it's now going to take place perhaps at a very large scale within a very short time frame. And this is why I think this requires our attention. Thanks.
Thank you. So we'll now take another two questions. First, I'll try my best for the pronunciation. I think it's Araceli or Araceli. If you can unmute yourself and ask the question yourself.
Okay, thank you. Is that Araceli?
Thank you.
Okay, so thank you for the lecture. My question is that climate change affects inflation, which is the main objective of central banks. My question goes that, for example, in Mexico, where I'm from, one climate event that is really concerning right now are droughts. So if central banks integrate climate change into their models, which is the main priority, mitigation or adaptation, it's like long term or short term. That's my question. Thank you.
Thank you. Should we take one more question, Yanis? So the next turn is Saikiran, and Ronald will come to you in the next round of answer, if that's okay. Let me find where Saikiran is so I can ask. Sorry, I'm struggling to find. There we go. Yes, can you unmute yourself.
Yeah, thank you, Hani. Yeah, thank you for the lecture, Yanis. Yeah, it was very nice to hear you. Yeah, my question is, it's more generic in nature. Yeah, let's say, I mean, we have this heterodox problem. Heterodox economics are talking about, lessening our consumption, right? But when you look at this present consumption-based economy, let's say the car industry, it's heavily produces employment, right? And there are consumption goods as well. If you're cutting down on consumption, then let's say the car industry, it's gonna have impact on employment. And then when you are shifting because of climate change, if you are shifting to heterodox based less consumption based economies, then how will you deal with this challenge? Yeah, that's the question. Thank you.
Thank you. Both questions were great. So I'll try to answer them. Let me start with central banking. First, there's a lot of discussion about the effects of climate change on inflation. There are different ways through which inflation can be affected by climate change. First, we have this term climate inflation, which refers to inflation that comes from primarily climate-related events, but also changes in gradual changes in atmospheric temperature. A couple of examples: if you have a hurricane that destroys properties, and then you have also that it destroys agricultural production, then you can have inflation. If you have that there is a climate-related event, let's say heat waves, that change completely the production of agricultural goods for a few months, this can have spillover effects on inflation around the world. And it has been argued that this is a real challenge for central banks, because central banks want to believe that they can control inflation by changing interest rates. But if you have supply side shocks coming from climate, it will become much more difficult for them to do so. And I think this is another reason why it's necessary to rethink completely central banking, because with climate change, we have so many fundamental changes in the way that the economy works, that this idea that central banks should primarily focus on inflation perhaps is not a very good one. But in terms of mitigation versus adaptation in the global south, as I said before, from a just perspective, I think adaptation makes more sense. The problem is that at the same time, the global north is doing things that will create some additional economic problems in the global south, because you have now IRA in the US, you have that the European Union is introducing these carbon pricing schemes about exports, and all this can make more difficult for countries in the global south to export carbon intensive goods. So this is a real challenge, because it means that if they don't make the transition, then they will be more exposed to these types of policies. So there is a pragmatic problem, which is that they have to find a way to find the right balance. But if you have the central banks, let's say if we think about India relies too much on coal. There's now a government now wants to support the transition, and the reason is not only because they want to contribute to the reduction of emissions. The net zero is after 2050 in India. But they also understand that if they don't make the transition, they will have some financial problems, because the transition is happening in the rest of the world. What the Reserve Bank of India is trying to do now is to understand what are the implications of this transition, and how some financial policies can be used in order to support this transition. And this can be both in the form of climate adaptation and climate mitigation. And in terms of tools, they are using the priority sector lending, which is a kind of a green guidance policy. They have recently introduced some other initiatives like green deposits and so on. This can help in terms of decarbonizing the financial system. They cannot be enough, but I think it makes sense to focus a little bit more on adaptation, because it's something that is going to affect the poor people in these countries. And it's important for both governments and other public authorities to look seriously into that. So in terms of tools, when you move beyond market neutrality, central banks have a lot of different options. And one of those is to try to support more green public investment. For instance, it's possible for, I don't want to go into the details, but it's possible to use things like collateral frameworks or purchases of assets in order to support specific securities that are issued by the government of your country that are considered to be used in order to support green projects. So there are tools that can be used, and some of these are more effective than others, but there are many different options. And just to mention another example, the first little bank that engaged with climate was the Bangladesh Bank. And this happened many, many years ago. I mean, those who know the discussions in Central Bank about climate, they think that this started from the Bank of England, but this is not true. The first little bank that started incorporating, including some schemes about climate, was the Bangladesh Bank. And one of the reasons why they did so is because it's one of the most climate vulnerable countries in the world, and they understand that this is a big problem. And from their perspective, it was important to support a kind of climate aligned development, because otherwise development cannot take place in some of these countries. And the tools are, again, can be a lot. I mean, if you have a central bank that doesn't have these restrictions that we have in central banks in the global north, there are many different things that you can do. Now, the question of car industry, very good question, and there's no straightforward answer. Now, first of all, if we think about, for instance, those who argue about the importance of having a circular economy, whereby, for instance, we have less cars, but we share cars. The idea has been that you might lose some jobs in the traditional car industry sector, but you might have more jobs in the services sector because there will be more people who will work in terms of how exactly you share cars. Now, we know that in practice, you cannot create a lot of employment in services in order to compensate the job losses perhaps in the car industry sector. And this is why the approach that has been used, let's say the more mainstream approach, is to decarbonize the car industry by having more electric vehicles. But having electric vehicles, we know that they are not necessarily great from an environmental perspective. First, because they rely on electricity that in many cases is not low carbon. And they also have a lot of materials. And actually, because of electric vehicles, we might have more green extractivism than what we have seen so far. So it's not, I wouldn't say that this is a solution. I mean, we might need to have more electric vehicles in order to support, for instance, public transport, but I don't think that we can have a solution to the environmental problems by having more, perhaps more cars, but electric cars that are electric. So I think the solution, I mean, there's no solution, no clear solution, but a different way to think about that is to think about what will happen to those people who will not be able to work in the car industry. And I mean, of course, a very standard way of thinking about that is to say that you can provide training to some people, as primarily to those that are perhaps younger, and give them the opportunity to find a different job later. Now, the private sector is not going to do that. You need to have massive public investment programs that are going to support these people once this transition happens. But you also need to think about what are the sectors that can absorb employment. And I think there will be some sectors that will expand as part of the green transition. The net effect might be negative. And I think this is why it's important to also think about working hours. Of course, it's easy to say that in theory, it's more difficult in practice. But if at the end of the day, we need to have an economy that is lower in terms of its size compared to what it was before, one way to distribute employment is to have working hours. So we need a combination of approaches, but what is very important is to have a public sector, I mean, that is going to work, of course, with local communities in order to find a combination of interventions that will minimize the side effects. I mean, I don't think it's correct to say that there will not be effects from the transition. I'm talking about negative economic effects and distributional effects. The question is how to find ways to minimize these effects. And the answer is that we should, of course, not leave it to the private sector. We need a public sector that is going to intervene quite a lot. And again, this goes back, of course, to what I said about political constraints. But if you ask me in theory what we should do, I think this would be the direction.
Thank you. I'm really enjoying this discussion. So we have 2 more questions. First, I will go to Ronald. You can unmute yourself now.
Okay, can you hear me? Well, I've been looking into some research on the relationship between GDP and the number of automobiles that a country has. So in the global north, as you call it, there's about 600 automobiles per 1,000 people. And adding automobiles doesn't make much of a difference in terms of growing GDP. But in the global south, we're talking about countries that have 30 cars per 1,000 people. We have extremely low automobility, and by that I mean mobility. So I would think that adding cars to the global south, if they are electric, would be a very good way to grow GDP without, without unduly harming the environment. That's my question.
Thank you. Shall I take one more question, or shall I respond to this?
Do you want to answer now, or because I think we have...
Yeah, I can do that. Yeah, sure. Thanks. I think that's a very good point. And I think this goes back to the discussion about climate justice, because if we look at the emissions that have been generated by, let's say, the use of cars, in the global north, there are a lot. But if we look at the global south, the reality is different. And of course, it makes sense to argue that countries that want to achieve economic development and they need to have more mobility, of course, they need to look at electric vehicles as a way of expanding an industry that is important for their development. And this is a way to have less emissions. So to have some expansion, of course, this will generate some pollution problems, but it will be much less compared to what has been done in the global north. So this goes back to the question of how we distribute the carbon budget that we have at the global level. And this is why we need to put priority on mitigation in the global north, and then to think about the different options in terms of mitigation that exist in the global south, and using as part of the broader approach, the greening of the industry, the car industry. Of course, this should also be considered. I think the problem is when we are talking about replicating what we have seen in the global north over the last decades in the global south. I think what needs to be done is to understand what are the needs in terms of improving development, improving the well-being of people, try to minimize as much as possible the use of not only, I mean, it's broader than automobiles, to reduce as much as possible consumption that is not so necessary. But in the context of development, of course, it makes sense to accept that this should be part of the solution. So yes, I would agree with that as long as we find the right balance.
Thank you. So I see one more question in the chat from Ali. Let me see where Ali is so I can ask. Oh, there we go. Hi, can you unmute yourself now?
Yes. Thank you so much, Hanni. Well, my question, many thanks for the thought-provoking presentation, Yanis. My question is from a broad political economy or broad social policy perspectives. I was wondering whether could you provide your thoughts. I know that it was not the focus of this presentation, sorry, but I would like to, will be happy if you could share with us your thoughts on the interactions, on the tensions, and the challenge between the green macroeconomic policies, but all the policies underpinning these just transitions, environmental policies in relation to employment policy. As we know, labor produce value, and green jobs has been put ahead or forward as one of the channels through which to justify the just environmental transitions. But from in heterogeneous different developing countries, for instance, in Mozambique, it's not clear the link with the productive base of the economy or structural transformation, alternatives, nothing is put forward. So I will be happy if you could elaborate a little bit on this and recommend maybe some studies. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot. That's a great question, and thanks for giving me the opportunity to say a couple of things about that. I think first of all we need to make it clear that when we are talking about green jobs, we do not necessarily have jobs that I think, as you highlight in the chat, are decent or they meet some labor standards. I mean, you can have a green job whereby the labor is exploited. We have very low labor standards. So for me, when we look at green, we just need to think about the same issues from a labor or social perspective as the issues that we look at, we think when we look at any type of job. So I think it's important to be very clear on that. I mean, creating some green jobs as part of having employment opportunities can be useful, of course, but we need to also find ways to respect some labor standards when we have these jobs. And this is not enough, because there's also a lot of discussion about what you said. If there's a green job that is created in a country whereby most of the, let's say, raw materials or inputs, and at the end of the day, the value added comes from abroad. So you might have that there will be a value added locally, which is very small compared to the whole supply chain. At the end of the day, you have jobs that do not add so much to employment in this economy, and you have a job that perhaps supports more countries in the global north because they have a much more significant role in the supply chain related to the production of this specific green goods. So we need to look into that, and this is why we need to have a holistic perspective, and we need to look at the whole structure of the economy in order to understand which green jobs might work, which might not work, and how to change the structure in order to make the green transition more conducive to local employment. But again, this is not enough. For instance, there's a lot of discussion about what green jobs mean for women, what they mean for social reproduction, and if we have green jobs that do not take into account the realities, the everyday life realities of women, and then you just say, this is going to create more green jobs for women. I mean, it's not going to work. So I think we need to have a holistic approach whereby we take into account how much green jobs contribute to domestic value added, to what extent green jobs are consistent with specific labor standards, and to what extent these green jobs take into account the reality that workers face in each country. If we don't have this discussion, if we don't take these perspectives into account, there is a very significant risk that just transition will be just in the name, in the sense that the argument will just be that those who might lose jobs in the carbon-intensive industry will find some jobs in the green sector, and that's the end of the story. And this is what I had in my mind when I said at the beginning of the lecture that when mainstream approaches look at issues around justice, they do that in a very superficial way. They're going to say that, but the way that they approach justice is very narrow. Yeah, so I think we just need a much more holistic perspective, and we need to take into account all these different approaches. And this is why also very important to work with other disciplines in order to understand better the implications of green jobs. Yeah, and I mean, yeah, happy to share studies. I mean, if you send me an email, I can share some links that you might find useful. Thank you.
Thank you. I see a virtual hand from Francisco. I'll ask you to unmute and ask.
Thank you. So thank you, Yanis, for your presentation. My question is regarding the climate debt nexus. So we know that there's a historic problem around financing development, which is now aggravated by climate change, whether by increasing borrowing costs or by the challenges that physical and transitional risks can bring to foreign currency revenues for countries in the global south, and further by private-based financial solutions that could worsen this issue. So my question is, in your view, what are the main channels of the climate debt nexus? What are the key challenges around it? And in your view, what are the main alternative initiatives to tackle this problem? Thank you.
Thank you. So yes, yeah, very important question yeah, it's a significant challenge for many countries right now. Let me talk a little bit about the specific issues related to this nexus. And as you highlighted, there are a lot. I mean, one comes from the so-called physical risks. If you have that the climate-related events that create problems in domestic production or destroy infrastructure, this does not only have an impact on the domestic economy, but can also affect the exports of a country. And then by having less exports, then foreign exchange reserves can also go down, which creates additional challenges. In terms of transition risks, yes, I mean, I mentioned before a couple of examples. If you have that there's a green policy in the global north, and the carbon-intensive exports become more expensive from the perspective of the global north, it means that there will be less demand for these goods, and this can again affect foreign exchange reserves and incomes in the global south. We can think of other channels as well through which this might materialize. But then, as I highlighted, the problem is that right now, everyone is talking about, I mean, in the financial industry, is talking about how significant it is to analyze transition and physical risks, and financial institutions need to do that. And what we are seeing is that credit rating agencies and other financial institutions do this analysis, and the overall result is that, yes, they don't want to be exposed to countries that seem to have high risks. So this is why this will increase interest rates. And what the problems that we have seen in the past with credit rating agencies will become even more substantial now with climate change. Now, how can we address this problem? I mean, many people are talking about the need to get rid of the credit rating agencies, or to have perhaps some public credit rating agencies. I mean, this is a little bit complicated. In theory, it will help a little bit, but I don't know if this will make a fundamental difference. Then what I said about the importance of having financial support in the form of grants is very significant. The question is how you do this. Why? Because, just to mention an example, if we don't have a mechanism which says that when a country faces a climate-related event, there is a way to get finance to address the losses automatically, then there will always be a downgrade of the country from credit rating agencies or other financial institutions. So what you need to have in theory is a mechanism which makes sure that when the countries face these climate challenges, there will be a financial support in principle in the form of grant that is going to address the problem, at least to some extent, because this is when if you have that, then it's less likely that the country risk will be perceived as high. And what I have said about the climate justice facility is that, I mean, you can read the details in my paper, but the idea is to find a way to say that the global north that has the ability to create money and is at the top of the currency hierarchy has to provide this finance to the global south because of climate justice, because of the climate debt. And we need to create a mechanism that does that automatically. In theory, for me, this is the only way to reduce significantly the problem. Any other solution like debt for climate swaps, which is now used quite a lot by several countries, they can provide only a very small, they can address a little bit some liquidity problems, but they cannot change fundamentally this vicious cycle. So we need much more fundamental changes that will make sure that finance will be available in the form of grants. This is my overall conclusion from this discussion. And I think the problem again is the political reality that countries in the global north do not want to accept the responsibility about the climate debt, and therefore it's very difficult to see something like that in practice. The loss and damage fund that was created in COP28 a few months ago reflects that, because it initially the idea of the fund started from the global south. Many countries in the global south highlighted that there should be a solution with damage, with loss and damage. But then what we saw was that the World Bank took the leadership in this fund. The contributions to this fund were made basically voluntary, and nobody talked about responsibilities based on justice. So this is the challenge that we are facing. The political reality is very far from what is necessary. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yanis. So if there's no more question, I think this is a good time to, that was like a good note to end upon. Kostas wanted to thank everybody who joined, and especially Yanis for this interesting lecture. He had to go, unfortunately, a bit quicker for a meeting. And I'd also personally like to say thank you on behalf of all the organizers to Yanis for providing this amazing lecture and the amazing discussion, and Adam as well, and everybody who joined. So we'll take a break over the summer, the upcoming summer, and then we'll come back the next academic year with another like exciting program for the next year. So thank you again, everybody, and we'll see you in next academic year. Bye, everyone.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you.